It was an ordinary morning in the small town of Maplewood, a quiet place where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing much ever seemed to happen. For Tara Miller, a young woman in her mid-20s, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. She lived on the edge of town in a modest house that she had inherited from her grandmother. Most days, she woke up early, made herself a cup of coffee, and then got to work with her usual routine. Tara wasn't a wealthy woman, but she was content. Her world was simple, filled with small acts of kindness. The most notable of these acts, something that had become part of her identity in Maplewood, was her daily ritual of collecting cans for recycling. To some, it might seem like an insignificant task, but to Tara, it was more than that. It was a way to keep the streets clean, to do her part for the environment, and most importantly, a way to make a small, honest living. Tara's neighbors knew her well enough. She was the kind of person who always said hello, who helped when someone was sick or needed an extra hand. She wasn't flashy, didn't care much for the limelight. She had a calm, gentle spirit that made her a quiet but well-loved figure in the community. Some people whispered that she was a little too quiet, that she kept to herself too much. But that was just Tara's way. She had been raised to keep her head down, not to draw attention, and it worked for her. The routine was always the same. Tara would step out of her house just as the sun began to rise, grabbing a large plastic bag, which she would fill with cans, bottles, and whatever recyclables she could find along the streets and alleys of Maplewood. People often noticed her walking, head down, her bag clinking with the noise of discarded cans. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and the few dollars she earned from recycling helped her cover her basic needs. In a small town like this, that was enough to get by. As she made her way down Main Street, the town still asleep, Tara's mind was often far away. She wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just letting her feet carry her along. She passed the bakery, where the sweet smell of fresh bread would greet her each morning. Then the old diner, its neon sign flickering to life as the town slowly stirred awake. The police station wasn't far, just a few blocks down from where she usually walked. It was a small station, a one-story building that looked more like a local post office than a place of law enforcement, but it did its job. On this particular morning, something was different. As Tara walked past the police station, she noticed a patrol car sitting outside. The car wasn't moving, which was unusual at this time of day. A uniformed officer, Officer Daniels, was sitting inside, his head leaning back against the seat as if he were lost in thought. Tara had seen him around town before. He was one of the more approachable officers, always polite, always kind. He waved at her as she passed, a small, friendly gesture, and she waved back, a soft smile on her face. There was nothing extraordinary about it, but for some reason, Tara felt a strange sensation, a quiet tug in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder. Officer Daniels' gaze seemed to linger on her for just a second too long. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something felt off. Shrugging it off, she turned the corner, heading toward the alley where she often found the most cans. It was the same alley she passed every day. And there, nestled near a stack of cardboard boxes, were the familiar glints of aluminum cans. Tara bent down, her hands instinctively reaching for the cans as she began stuffing them into her bag. The peacefulness of the moment, however, was suddenly interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance. Tara stood up, pausing for a moment as the sirens grew louder. Her heart skipped a beat, the noise filling her ears as the patrol car she had seen earlier came into view, speeding around the corner and heading straight toward her. Tara felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't unusual for the small town. Sirens didn't blare often, but when they did, it was typically for something minor, a fender bender or a traffic stop. But something about the speed of the car, the urgency in its approach, made Tara uneasy. The patrol car pulled up beside her with a screech of tires, and the driver's side window rolled down, revealing none other than Officer Daniels. His expression was serious, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Tara. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Tara couldn't help but notice how different he seemed today. Gone was the warm, friendly face she usually saw. Instead, Officer Daniels appeared tense, almost as if he were on edge. His brow furrowed as he took a long look at her, his eyes scanning her and then quickly darting to the bag of cans at her side. He didn't smile. He didn't greet her. Instead, he simply stared. "Ma'am," he began, his voice sounding unusually stern. "I need to speak with you." Tara's stomach tightened. Her mind raced, wondering what she had done wrong. She wasn't involved in any crime. She wasn't doing anything illegal. She was just collecting cans, a task that had been part of her routine for years. But something in Officer Daniels' voice made her uneasy. She stopped in her tracks, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry, officer," Tara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Did I do something wrong?" Officer Daniels didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her for a long moment, his lips pressed tightly together. Then, slowly, he pulled out a piece of paper from his dashboard, unfolded it, and held it up in front of her. "You've been reported for causing a public disturbance," he said, his voice cold, more distant than she had ever heard it. "A complaint was filed this morning." Tara's heart dropped. She looked at the citation in his hand, confused. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just collecting cans. Nothing more, nothing less. Who could possibly think she was causing a disturbance? I don't understand," she stammered. "I'm just picking up cans. Why would anyone report me for that?" But Officer Daniels didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked at her again, his gaze unreadable. Tara felt a pang of frustration rise inside her. Why was he treating her like this? Why was this happening? Her world, which had always been simple and predictable, was suddenly spinning out of control, and she had no idea why. Tara took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had to stay composed. She didn't know what was going on, but she was determined to figure it out. What was the real story here? Why was Officer Daniels so upset, and why had this all happened so suddenly? As she stood there, processing the situation, she had no idea that this seemingly insignificant moment would soon unravel into something much bigger than she ever expected. Tara stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on the citation in Officer Daniels' hand. The words on the paper blurred before her as the reality of the situation began to settle in. A public disturbance. For collecting cans, she glanced around, but the street was empty, no one else in sight. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like forever, her mind racing for an explanation, trying to piece together any clue that could explain what was happening. Officer Daniels didn't seem in a hurry to say anything more, his posture stiff and impassive. Tara felt her stomach twist in confusion and anxiety. "Is there a mistake?" Tara asked, her voice shaky, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "I don't understand. I'm just recycling. This is what I do every day." But instead of offering an explanation or a hint of reassurance, Officer Daniels simply nodded, his eyes flicking from the citation back to her bag of cans. His expression remained unreadable, and there was no warmth in his gaze anymore. His usual friendly demeanor had evaporated completely, leaving behind a man who seemed like a stranger. "You've been reported," he said again, his voice flat. "That's all I know." Tara's heart began to beat faster. It didn't make sense. Who would report her for recycling? She was well known in the town, not just for her quiet nature, but for the work she did. Her simple act of collecting cans wasn't just a way to make a few extra dollars. It was part of the fabric of the community. It helped keep the streets cleaner, and people saw her as a small, positive force in their lives. Tara's mind struggled to find an answer, but nothing clicked. She thought of the handful of people who might dislike her, but none of them had ever shown any sign of animosity. No one in the town had ever openly objected to her. She wasn't causing trouble. She wasn't even causing a scene. She simply walked through the streets with her bag, picking up what others had left behind, doing her part. So why would anyone want to ruin her routine, especially by sending a police officer after her? Suddenly, Officer Daniels seemed to snap back into reality. He sighed heavily and lowered the citation. His hands fidgeted with the paper for a moment before he looked at Tara, his expression softer now, but still serious. "I'm sorry, Tara," he said, his voice almost apologetic. "I'm just doing my job. You're free to go, but you'll need to come in to clear this up." Tara blinked, still processing his words. "Clear this up? How?" she asked, her voice rising in frustration. "What do I even need to clear up? There's nothing to clear up. I'm just picking up cans." Officer Daniels didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, shifting from foot to foot, glancing around as if unsure of what to say next. There was an awkward tension hanging in the air, the kind that made Tara feel both helpless and angry at the same time. For a brief moment, she considered walking away, ignoring the officer, and continuing with her day. But something in his demeanor stopped her. Something felt off, like there was more to this than just a misunderstanding. After another long pause, Officer Daniels sighed again, the weight of whatever was going on finally starting to show on his face. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he hesitated. Finally, with a soft voice, he spoke again, this time with a hint of regret in his words. "You don't deserve this, Tara, but I don't have all the information. There was a complaint filed, and I had to respond. I don't know why anyone would make a report about you. I can't explain it. But I'm telling you this isn't personal." Tara frowned, taking in his words. "Then why are you here, officer? If it's not personal, why are you giving me this citation?" She motioned to the paper still clutched in his hand. "This feels like an attack. This isn't a mistake. Something's wrong here." For a moment, Officer Daniels looked at her with a look of confusion, then something else, almost like guilt, flickered in his eyes. He cleared his throat, his voice dropping as if he were struggling to hold back an emotion that had clearly been building up for some time. "There's more going on here than just a complaint, Tara. He paused, as if trying to gather his thoughts. "I'm sorry. I don't even know why I'm saying all this. But I'm telling you now, this isn't just about you and the cans. There's something bigger at play, something you don't know." Tara stared at him, her confusion deepening. "What are you talking about? What bigger thing? What's going on?" Her voice was rising now, a mix of frustration and fear edging into her words. "I can't go into it," Officer Daniels said, his voice low and strained. "But the truth is, there are some people in this town who have been watching you. Not just you, but your family too. And I'm afraid this is the beginning of something you won't be able to stop." He looked down at his hands, his voice becoming almost a whisper. "I wish I could tell you everything, but I can't. Not now." Tara felt a chill creep up her spine. What was he saying? Was this about her family? Was someone threatening her? She tried to piece together what she knew about her life in Maplewood, her quiet existence, her daily routine. She couldn't think of anything or anyone who would want to harm her. She had no enemies, no one who would want to drag her into some kind of mess. But the officer's words hung heavy in the air, and suddenly she realized that this simple morning was about to spiral into something she wasn't prepared for. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice trembling now. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to Officer Daniels or herself. The weight of his words seemed to grow with every passing second. Was this truly the beginning of something that would change everything? What was happening in her town, and why was she being dragged into it? Officer Daniels shifted his stance again, looking at Tara with a deep sadness in his eyes. "I don't know, Tara," he said, his voice barely audible now. "I don't know what's coming next. But please, be careful. And if you hear anything, if you see anything strange, you come to me. I'll do what I can to help. But right now, there's not much I can do except tell you the truth. And hope you understand." Tara stood there, staring at him, her mind whirling with questions, none of which seemed to have answers. Officer Daniels climbed back into his patrol car without another word, and with a soft hum of the engine, he drove off. leaving her standing in the empty street, her heart heavy with confusion and dread. As the silence settled back over the town, Tara looked down at the citation still in her hands. Her fingers gripped the paper tightly as the weight of what had just happened sank in. Nothing about this day felt normal anymore. And as she walked slowly back down the street, her thoughts kept circling around Officer Daniel's cryptic words. Something bigger at play. What could that possibly mean? And why was it happening to her? The world around her seemed to blur as she walked home, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the morning. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed. And in the pit of her stomach, she couldn't help but wonder, was she ready for whatever was coming next? The rest of the day passed in a blur for Tara. The usual rhythm of her life had been completely disrupted, and no matter how hard she tried to return to her routine, everything felt off. As she walked back to her house, the citation crumpled in her hand. She couldn't stop replaying Officer Daniel's words in her mind. Something bigger was at play, something that she didn't understand. Her thoughts were consumed with confusion, and her steps were slower than usual as she wondered what exactly was coming for her. She had always lived her life quietly. Why was she being caught in the middle of whatever this was? By the time she reached her front porch, the sun had risen high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the town. It was as though the world was going about its business as usual, but to Tara, it felt like everything had changed. She stood on the porch for a moment, staring at the street that seemed so familiar, yet now felt strangely foreign. For the first time in a long while, she felt exposed, like someone was watching her every move. Inside, Tara dropped her bag of cans on the kitchen table and paced. Her grandmother's old house creaked in the quiet, and it felt like she was walking in a fog. The sound of her footsteps echoed off the walls, amplifying the anxiety she felt. She needed answers, but where could she find them? Who could she trust? Tara didn't have any answers to give herself, so she sat down at the kitchen table and reached for the phone, hoping that maybe calling someone, anyone, would help her make sense of what had just happened. The first person she thought of was Sandra, her best friend and neighbor. Sandra had lived next door to her for years, and they were close, more like family than friends. Tara dialed her number, trying to steady her breath as it rang. Sandra answered on the second ring, her voice warm and comforting as always. Tara. Hey, what's up? Tara hesitated, unsure of how to start. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but she needed to explain everything. Sandra, something weird happened today. I need to talk to you about it. Of course, Sandra said immediately, her tone shifting to concern. What's going on? Tara took a deep breath. I was out picking up cans like I always do, and I ran into Officer Daniels. He gave me this citation. Someone reported me for causing a public disturbance. But Sandra, I don't even know who would report me. I haven't done anything wrong. I just collect cans. And then he said there's something bigger going on, but he didn't explain it. He just told me to be careful and left. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Tara's heart sank, her anxiety rising as she waited for Sandra's response. Finally, Sandra spoke, her voice low. What do you mean something bigger? She asked. That doesn't sound right, Tara. I don't like the sound of it. I don't know, Tara replied, her voice cracking. That's the part that's bothering me. I don't know who would report me or why. Why would anyone want to accuse me of something? I don't even talk to people unless I'm helping out. I don't get it. Sandra was quiet for a moment before she spoke again, a serious edge to her voice. I don't want to freak you out, but I've been hearing some strange things around town. Nothing specific, just little whispers. People talking about things that don't make sense. Some of them have been talking about you, Tara. I don't know who or why, but I'm worried. Tara's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying? What are people saying about me? I don't know everything, Sandra admitted, but you know how people are in a small town. They like to talk. I've overheard some gossip at the diner and the grocery store, and there's been talk about you, your family, mostly, about your grandmother's old house. People say there's something strange about it." Tara's mind raced. Her grandmother's house was just an old family home, nothing extraordinary about it. It had been passed down through generations, and there was nothing unusual about her family's past. But now, with Sandra's words hanging in the air, Tara wasn't so sure. "What do they mean by strange? What's going on, Sandra?" Sandra hesitated before answering. "I don't know specifics, Tara, but I'm telling you, there's something happening in this town. Something's shifting. People are getting more, I don't know, secretive. And I don't like it. You need to be careful. Don't trust just anyone." Tara felt a chill run through her as the weight of Sandra's warning settled in. It felt like everything was starting to unravel, and she was caught right in the middle of it. "I don't know what's going on, Sandra. But I need to figure it out. I need to know who's behind this, and I need to know why." "You'll figure it out," Sandra said, her voice soft but firm. "But promise me you'll be careful. Keep your eyes open, okay? Something doesn't feel right about this." "I promise," Tara replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something much bigger than herself, something she couldn't control. "Thanks, Sandra. I'll be careful." After hanging up, Tara sat for a moment, staring at the phone in her hand, her mind whirling with the information Sandra had given her. Whispered gossip, strange behavior around town, and now Officer Daniel's cryptic warning. It felt like all the small threads of her life were beginning to tangle, pulling her into something she didn't understand. Her hand shook as she placed the phone back on the table. She stood and walked to the window, peering out at the street where she had just walked a few hours ago. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but Tara couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing under the surface. She had always prided herself on being a quiet observer, blending into the background, never seeking attention. But now, for the first time in her life, she felt like the focus of something much darker than she could have ever imagined. As she stood there, staring out the window, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Sandra. "Just be careful, Tara. I don't want you getting caught up in whatever's going on. If you hear anything, you let me know, okay?" Tara's throat tightened, and for the first time that day, she felt a deep sense of unease. Everything was changing, and she had no idea how to stop it. But one thing was clear: she couldn't stay in the dark. She had to get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. Her quiet, peaceful life had already been shattered, and there was no going back. What had started with a simple walk to collect cans was now leading her down a path that would change everything about her town, and about her place in the world. And she was no longer sure if she was ready for what was about to come next. The next few days felt like a haze for Tara. She spent her time going through the motions, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, despite the tension that clung to every corner of her life. The town, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like a web of secrets. She couldn't walk down the street without feeling like eyes were on her, watching her every move. Her routine of collecting cans became more of a chore than a simple act of recycling. It felt like everything she did, every step she took, was under a microscope. The tension had escalated, and Tara couldn't ignore it any longer. Each morning, she saw the subtle signs: the way people averted their eyes when she passed by, the hushed conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room, the way the air seemed to crackle with something unspoken. It wasn't just the gossip. Something in the very atmosphere of Maplewood had shifted, and Tara had the distinct feeling that she was at the center of it. On the fourth day after her encounter with Officer Daniels, Tara woke up to find a message waiting for her. It was from an unknown number, but she recognized the area code as local. Her fingers trembled as she opened the text. "Meet me at the park at 3 p.m. Don't bring anyone." The message was simple, but its implications were anything but. Tara had no idea who had sent it, but there was something in the message that felt urgent, something that pushed her to follow through. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to play it safe. But the desire to uncover the truth was too strong. She had already been thrust into this tangled web, and she needed answers. What had Officer Daniels meant when he said that something bigger was at play? Who was behind all of this, and why was she being targeted? That afternoon, Tara drove to the park, her heart racing in her chest. She parked near the entrance and sat in her car for a few moments, watching the clock tick closer to 3 p.m. The park was empty, save for the occasional jogger or cyclist passing by. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, considering the tension that had been mounting in her life. Tara kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting someone to be watching her from the shadows. At exactly 3 p.m., a figure emerged from the trees at the edge of the park. It was Officer Daniels, his uniform slightly disheveled, his face tense and strained. Tara felt her heart skip a beat. He had reached out to her in this cryptic way, but she wasn't sure what to expect. As he approached, his eyes locked onto hers, a flicker of something, regret, maybe fear, passing across his features. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low and cautious. There was a weight to his words, as if they carried more meaning than the simple gratitude they seemed to express. Tara didn't respond right away. She just studied him, trying to make sense of the man who had once seemed so calm, so professional, but who now seemed like a broken version of himself. "What's going on, Officer Daniels?" she finally asked, her voice steady but filled with a mix of frustration and concern. "I've been getting messages. I've been hearing things. What do you know about this? Why are people saying things about me?" Officer Daniels took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. "Tara, there's no easy way to say this," he began, his eyes flickering to the ground before meeting her gaze once more. "The complaint against you, it wasn't just some random accusation. Someone is targeting you. And it's not just you, it's your family. It's your grandmother's house. They're connected." Tara's mind whirled at the mention of her grandmother's house. "What do you mean my family is involved?" "My grandmother's house has been in my family for generations. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing to hide." Officer Daniels hesitated, glancing around nervously, almost as if he were worried that someone was listening. He lowered his voice even further. "The house, it's not what it seems. It has a history, a long history. There are people who want it, badly, and they'll do anything to get it. They'll use anyone to get what they want, even you." Tara felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. "What are you talking about? This sounds crazy. What do people want with my grandmother's house? It's just an old house. There's nothing special about it." "I wish I could explain everything," Officer Daniels said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "But the truth is, I don't know everything myself. What I do know is that the house is connected to something much bigger than you can imagine. There are people in this town who have been watching it for years, and now, it seems like they've decided it's time to make their move." Tara's heart pounded in her chest. She had grown up in that house, loved every inch of it, every creaky floorboard and every faded wallpaper. The thought that someone, or something, was after it felt unreal. How could it possibly matter to anyone outside her family? How could it be tied to anything sinister? "Who are these people? What do they want with me?" Tara asked, her voice trembling now. She was scared, more scared than she'd ever been, but she wasn't going to back down. She needed to understand what was happening. Officer Daniels looked around again, then stepped closer to her, lowering his voice to a whisper. "There's a group, an old network that has been operating in the shadows for years. Some of them are right here in town, hiding in plain sight. They've been pulling strings for a long time, trying to get their hands on certain properties, including your grandmother's. It's all about power, money, control. They'll do anything to get what they want. And now, they're coming for you." Tara felt her knees weaken. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they made no sense. Why would anyone go after her family? Why would anyone care about a small house in Maplewood? But looking into Officer Daniels' eyes, she could see the sincerity, the fear. He was scared, too. That's when it hit her. This wasn't just about her. This was about something bigger, something much darker than she could ever have imagined. "I know this sounds insane," Officer Daniels continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But you need to understand, this isn't just about some accusation over recycling. That was just the first step. They're testing you. They want to see how far they can push you, how much you'll take before you crack. I was hoping you could get out of town, get away from all of this before things get worse. But now it's already too late. They've already noticed you, and there's no turning back." Tara's breath hitched in her throat. Her life, as simple as it had been just a few days ago, had completely shattered. Her quiet town was not what it seemed. Her family's past was not what it seemed. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and she suddenly felt very small and very alone in this vast, unfamiliar world of shadows and secrets. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let them take everything she held dear. She wasn't going to run. She was going to fight. She looked at Officer Daniels, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm not running," she said, her voice steady now. "I'm not leaving. I'm going to find out who these people are, and I'm going to stop them, whatever it takes." Officer Daniels didn't reply at first. He just stared at her, as though trying to decide whether to warn her one last time. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I can't promise you that you'll be safe, but if you're going to do this, Tara, you need to be prepared. You need to trust no one, not even me. They're everywhere, and they're watching. Always." Tara felt a chill sweep through her, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She wasn't going to back down. Whatever this shadowy group was, whoever they were, they had just made a powerful enemy. As she turned to leave, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Her world had been turned upside down, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Because if there was one thing she knew for certain now, it was that she couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. The fight for her family, her home, and her future had only just begun. The days that followed Officer Daniels' cryptic warning were nothing like Tara had ever experienced. The weight of his words hung over her like a dark cloud, and the sense of urgency, of something ominous creeping closer, gnawed at her every waking moment. She could feel the eyes of the town on her, even when no one was around. She was no longer just a quiet woman collecting cans. She was now a target, thrust into a world of hidden forces, shadowy figures, and dark secrets. Her family's home, the old house that had stood for generations, was suddenly the center of everything. Tara couldn't shake the feeling that it had always been there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right time to surface. Her grandmother, who had passed away years ago, had never spoken of the house's history in detail. Tara remembered her grandmother's occasional cryptic remarks about the place, how it had been in the family for so long, how it had a soul of its own. But Tara had always dismissed them as old stories, passed down through the years. Now, they seemed like warnings she hadn't understood. The more Tara tried to uncover, the more questions seemed to pile up. The phone calls, the anonymous texts, the unsettling encounters at the grocery store. There was no escape from the growing tension. Every corner she turned, every person she spoke to, felt like another piece of the puzzle. Yet the pieces weren't fitting together, only pushing her further into confusion. She had always considered herself a logical person, someone who could piece things together with a clear mind. But now, it felt like the more she tried to understand, the further away the truth became. And then came the first real sign that things had already started to spiral out of control. It was a late afternoon when it happened. Tara had been walking home from the corner store, her mind still reeling from a conversation with Sandra about possible hidden histories in the town. Sandra had mentioned something about old town records, about properties that were sold under strange circumstances, and about people who were connected to the land in ways that didn't make sense. Tara had thought about looking into it, but she hadn't gotten far, until now. As she walked past the empty lot near the old church, she noticed a black car parked a few feet away, its windows tinted. There was no one inside, but it had the unmistakable feel of a presence, a warning. She froze for a moment, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. She had seen that car before, just last week, parked outside her grandmother's house. Tara's pulse quickened, and her stomach dropped. Was it coincidence, or was someone watching her? Her mind raced with possibilities, but she didn't have time to linger. The sound of a door creaking open broke her from her thoughts, and before she could react, a man stepped out from behind the car. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features, wearing a long, dark coat that seemed out of place for the weather. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Are you Tara Miller?" His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, and his gaze didn't waver. Tara took an instinctive step back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Though the nervousness was evident, she had to remain composed. She couldn't let him see how scared she really was. "My name is Luke," the man said, taking the slow step toward her. "I've been looking for you." His smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was something cold in his demeanor that made Tara's skin crawl. "You've been asking questions, poking around where you shouldn't. You're stirring up trouble, and that's not something we take lightly." Tara's mind raced. She had heard of people like him, people who lurked in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes, enforcing silence through intimidation and fear. And now, it seemed like she had just encountered one of them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tara said, trying to keep her voice calm, but the words felt hollow. "I haven't done anything. I'm just trying to understand what's going on." Luke chuckled softly, a sound that sent a chill through her. "Oh, I think you know exactly what's going on, Tara. You just don't want to face the truth. You're starting to uncover something that's been buried for a long time. You're starting to see what we've been keeping hidden." He took another step closer, and Tara instinctively backed away, but he kept following her, his presence suffocating. "You should have stayed quiet," he continued, his voice darkening. "You should have kept your head down like everyone else. But now you've caught our attention, and that's a problem." Tara's mind was spinning. She needed to get out of there, but her legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the ground. This was it, the thing she had been afraid of, the thing that had been hovering on the edge of her thoughts, was finally here. She had been thrust into something dangerous, something far bigger than a simple complaint over recycling. And now, the very people who had been watching her were making their move. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word, despite the knot of fear in her stomach. "You can't intimidate me. I'm going to find out what's going on, and I won't stop until I do." Luke's expression hardened, his smile fading. "That's where you're wrong, Tara," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're already in over your head. And the more you push, the worse it's going to get for you." Tara turned on her heel, her heart racing as she ran toward the nearest exit of the park. The sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, but she didn't dare look back. She couldn't let them catch her, not when she was so close to finding out the truth. The adrenaline surged through her veins, pushing her to run faster. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to keep moving. She had to get away, at least for now. Luke's warning echoed in her ears as she pushed herself harder. By the time she reached her car, her breath came in ragged gasps, her body shaking with a mix of fear and the rush of survival instincts. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it instantly, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Her mind was reeling. She had just come face to face with someone connected to the network that Officer Daniels had warned her about. Someone who wasn't afraid to use fear and intimidation to protect their secrets. The car's engine roared to life, and Tara sped out of the parking lot, not looking back. But the damage had already been done. The moment she had been trying to avoid had arrived. The shadows had found her, and now she had no choice but to dive deeper into the darkness if she was ever going to uncover the truth. Tara wasn't sure what would happen next. She wasn't sure if she could trust anyone, But one thing was certain. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The fallout from her actions was already starting to unfold, and there was no turning back. The battle for her family's legacy, her home, and her future had only just begun. Tara didn't sleep that night. The adrenaline from her encounter with Luke still coursed through her veins, and her mind was too active, too frantic to rest. She had crossed a line, stepped into a shadowed world of conspiracies, threats, and manipulation that she had never imagined existed in her quiet town. The mysterious forces after her family's home were not just about land or money. They were about power. And that power had a long history, one that Tara was now irrevocably a part of. In the days that followed, Tara's world grew smaller. The walls of Maplewood, once comforting and familiar, began to feel like a prison. Every time she stepped outside, she wondered if someone was watching her. Every glance from a neighbor, every hushed conversation, sent a jolt of suspicion through her. She had to keep moving. She had to keep her head down, but she also had to learn everything she could to outsmart the people who were hunting her family and her. Sandra tried to reach out, but Tara avoided her calls. She couldn't risk anyone close to her getting involved, not when she didn't understand the full scope of what she was facing. But her isolation only deepened the sense of danger. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. Officer Daniels, the only person who had seemed to offer her any kind of help, was suddenly distant, his presence almost non-existent. He had warned her about the danger, but now he seemed as if he were keeping his distance, hiding in the shadows like everyone else. The cryptic message Luke had sent her echoed in her mind. "You've caught our attention," he had said. Tara hadn't fully understood the meaning behind his words then, but now it was clear. She had become a pawn in a much larger game, a game that didn't care about her, her life, or her family's legacy. They wanted something, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. The house, the land, the history behind it. None of it was just a simple matter of ownership. It was much more than that. Tara knew she had to confront this head-on, even if she didn't understand all the pieces of the puzzle. But before she could plan her next move, something happened that changed everything. It was early morning when Tara received an anonymous envelope slipped through the slot in her door. No return address, no name, just a thick, cream-colored paper with neat handwriting. Her hand shook as she opened it, the envelope feeling heavier than she had expected. Inside, there was a single piece of paper, and on it, written in bold, black ink, were the words, "You're in over your head. Leave, or the next step will be irreversible." Tara's heart pounded in her chest as she read the message again. The words were simple, but the threat was clear. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about her life. Whoever had sent this message knew everything. They knew where she lived, they knew what she was trying to uncover, and they were willing to do anything to stop her. She sat down at her kitchen table, the message still in her hands. What could she do? What options did she have left? She had been trying to fight back, to uncover the truth, but now she was being pushed into a corner. Every step she took, every question she asked, seemed to make the danger worse. Was this all just too much for her to handle? Had she underestimated the power of the forces against her? But then she remembered Officer Daniels' words. "You need to trust no one, not even me. They're everywhere, and they're watching. Always." She thought of the man she had met in the park, Luke, and the way he had looked at her, cold, calculating, like he was already planning his next move. She thought of the hidden network that had been pulling strings in the town for years, people who knew far more about her family than she did. And then she thought of her grandmother's house, the legacy she had been trying to protect, the life she had been trying to preserve. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol, a piece of history, a part of who she was. Tara knew she couldn't walk away. She couldn't let fear control her. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about standing up for what was right. Her family had lived in this town for generations. They had contributed to it, built it, and made it what it was. Now someone wanted to tear it all down, to erase that history, And if she walked away now, if she gave in to the threats, everything her family had built would be lost. Tara wasn't ready to let that happen. She wasn't ready to back down. The next morning, Tara drove to the old town hall, the place where the records of Maplewood's history were stored. It was a small, outdated building, wedged between the town library and the post office. The halls were dim, and the air inside smelled of old paper and dust. She walked to the back, where the dusty archives were kept, and approached the desk. The woman behind it, an older librarian named Mrs. Patterson, looked up with a puzzled expression. "Can I help you, Miss Miller?" she asked, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "I need to look at some town records," Tara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Specifically, anything related to property ownership or deeds. My family's house, to be exact." Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "I see. I'll have to pull the old files from the back. It'll take a moment." Tara followed her into the back room, where she was handed a large folder filled with papers, maps, and old documents. As she scanned through the pages, something caught her eye. There, buried in the midst of an old property deed from decades ago, was a name she didn't recognize. Harrison Bellamy. Her fingers paused on the name. She'd never heard of a Harrison Bellamy before. She quickly flipped through the pages, tracing the name to an old document detailing a property dispute between the Bellamy family and the Millers, dating back to the 1920s. The Bellamys had claimed that the Millers had stolen land from them, that the property they owned rightfully belonged to them. Tara's heart raced. This was the missing piece she had been searching for. The Bellamys, whoever they were, had been after her family's land for nearly a century. The history of conflict over the property had been buried, hidden from the public. And now, somehow, this old dispute had resurfaced. The Bellamys had been waiting for the right moment to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Tara felt a deep sense of foreboding. The people behind this, the ones who had been watching her, weren't just after the house. They were after everything. The history, the legacy, the power. As Tara left the town hall with the documents in her hands, she realized that she was closer to the truth than ever before. But now, more than ever, she knew that the fight she was about to face would not be just about her family's house. It would be about her family's future, about everything they had built, and about protecting the legacy of Maplewood from forces that had been lying in wait for far too long. Tara had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. Ready to uncover the secrets, face the people who had been hiding in the shadows, and protect what was hers. The game had changed, and Tara Miller was determined to win it.